So welcome, great to see all of you here. Plastic normally engages a lot of people, so I'm happy that that's the case also today. The topic of this seminar then is carbon dioxide or crops. What is the future of plastics? And my name is Ellen Palm. I'm a PhD student here at Lund University at Environmental and Energy System Studies. And well, I would wish to welcome you all, and I hope that we will learn something new today, and that it will be fruitful discussion with our panelists. Well, I guess you've all had some coffee and smoothies here. And I would also like to inform you that the event is being filmed and that photos will be taken. So if you wish to not be part of that, choose a sort of more hidden position. And I will ask the panelists questions later, but I also encourage you to raise your hands if you have questions of your own, so you can think about that during the presentations. First, all the three panelists will give a brief 10 minutes or so presentation on their topic, and then after that we will have the panel discussion. So that's sort of the outline. And before I present our first speaker, I was asked to sort of present the topic of plastic in 1 or 2 minutes. So what I chose actually to only highlight one thing then. This seminar is about plastic feedstock. So it's about the carbon atoms in the plastic. So plastic is produced from fossil fuels, and that's a sustainability issue. And therefore, there are different initiatives to change this. And well, as you will hear, there are different options to do that. And there are, of course, other, perhaps equally or even more, I don't know, we will see during the discussions, aspects of plastic. Littering, overconsumption, waste management, there are various topics. But today the topic will be plastic feedstock. Yeah, so I think that's sort of all. I guess you all have a relationship to plastic already, and but it won't be to any specific products or so. This would be a more general discussion on feedstock. But of course, if you have other questions, you can ask them other way. So the connection here to the transformation of the hållbarhetsveckan is the fossil feedstock. So you know what it's about. And first then, with presenting one of the options to a fossil-free plastic, is Christian Hulteberg, who's a senior lecturer at the Department of Chemical Engineering here at Lund University. He's had various engagement with the chemical industry during many years, and then, amongst other things, has worked with carbon dioxide as a feedstock. So very, very welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Ooh, that was loud. Let's see if we can adjust that a little. There we are. So, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is normally what we considered the end product. So when we transform things, it usually becomes stuff and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is usually emitted to atmosphere through some kind of chimney or end tailpipe, something like that. But there are certain applications already today for carbon dioxide in the chemical industry. I will see if we could mention a few of those, and also look at future prospects of using CO2 as a feedstock moving forward. Why do we want to do this though? So what is the driving force in moving towards using carbon dioxide for anything basically? Well, it's definitely a source of carbon atoms. Today, carbon atoms are not that scarce. We are picking up at about 100 billion barrels or million barrels per day of oil, which contains a lot of carbon. But if you envision, and it seems to be happening, that we are moving more and more towards electrification, there will be less and less carbon produced through oil refining. And if you take the chemical industry on its own and envision that you've electrified all the cars and all the transport, and we have no need for diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, those kind of things, then the chemical industry will not be able to afford to pick oil up from the ground, because it's really expensive to do all this prospecting, and the chemical industry, which is much, much smaller than the fuel industry, will not be able to afford this on their own. So it will have to change. So, and even if we go to electrification of cars and transportation, we will still be needing materials. So plastics, fibers, other things that are made from oil today, like clothes and things like that, will still have a need for that. So there will still be a need for carbon. So carbon dioxide is one possible solution to that. And right now there's really no lack of carbon dioxide. If it's anything we have a lot of, it's carbon dioxide. 24 billion tons per year is emitted. Of course, this goes hand in hand with the fossil fuel use. But if you look at the chemical industry today, you don't have to remember this by heart, but just take a look at the left-hand side. Yes, your left-hand side. You see that from 4 feedstocks: natural gas, petroleum, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur, we can basically produce anything you see around you in this room. So all plastics, all glue that keeps the floor together, the paints and everything, is made out of these 4 feedstocks. So we're quite spoiled, and I guess part of this debate or discussion today is how we can broaden this picture slightly. But yeah, so we make a few intermediates in the first section there, and then the further down we get into the chemical tree, the closer we get to consumer goods, the more advanced the molecules get and the lower the volumes. Yes. And I said that the world market was, or production of carbon dioxide was 24 billion. The largest organic chemical is ethylene, and it's produced at about 150 million tons per year. So it's still a few orders of magnitude more carbon dioxide produced today than we use in chemicals. Carbon dioxide, yeah, from energy production, but also from the chemical industry, and we also produce a little from fermentation. So when we make ethanol for cars or for wine or whatever, it's produced in there. But what we can then do is use it either directly, so physical utilization. We take carbon dioxide and we use the molecule as it is. We can liquefy it, use it as a heat carrier medium, or we can use it in a chemical process. So physical utilization or thermal or chemical utilization is 2 options that we have. We do use carbon dioxide as a feedstock already in the chemical industry today, especially for making hydrogen and also for making urea. So transforming ammonia into urea requires carbon dioxide. So there's already today a use and a consumption. Yes. Moving forward, there are new ways that we can use carbon dioxide, and I won't go into the details today, but you could basically use heat to convert carbon dioxide into something useful. You can use it and with light transform it into other chemicals. You can use electricity, or you can use photons, or indeed you can feed it to bugs to make chemicals and stuff. However, there's one problem. As I said, carbon dioxide is the end point. So this is what we are left with when we've used all the energy. So carbon dioxide is really without any chemical energy. So we need to add quite a significant amount of energy to relift carbon dioxide into the energy level to make plastics or chemicals or whatever we want to do. So none of these new applications is without energy input. But if we choose energy with a renewable footprint, then that solves the sustainability issue. So from my perspective, this electrification of the chemical, steel, and other industries that seems to be ongoing right now is really something that we didn't see 10 years ago. It's really changing the industry profoundly. It's driven by much lower cost of electricity production from renewables. Solar power today is lower cost in new installation than coal power is. It's quite ironic. There's actually a coal museum in the US that installed solar panels because it's more or less expensive than buying coal-powered coal power. Yeah. There's also other ways to use electricity with carbon dioxide to produce intermediates, making it possible to continue to use the same infrastructure that we have today. So carbon dioxide with low cost energy also allows us to maintain the same sort of production infrastructure today as we have, or well, continue to use the same infrastructure tomorrow, which is a big advantage in my book. It also means that you can with limited investment phase in carbon dioxide as a feedstock without having to remove completely the existing infrastructure. So to summarize, we have already today a large use of CO2 in chemicals and petrochemicals. The main problem, if you want to call it that, is that CO2 is the endpoint. We need to add a lot of energy to turn it into something useful. But the advent of electrification really makes this something worthwhile looking into. And with that, I thank you for listening for a few minutes to me. Thank you.
I want to ask questions already, but I will wait. Or maybe I can ask you one question, because it's very much on this slide, Christian. Because you say that it's, using carbon dioxide within the chemical industry could make sense, because if you use renewable energy, because then there is no sort of other carbon emissions, right? But as you stated, it requires quite a lot of renewable electricity, so one has to manage that resource wisely as well. Do you think that it would make sense to use carbon dioxide to produce plastics?
It depends on where we are in the future. I mean, if we are in a position where we are not extracting a lot of fossil oil from the ground and we have no other carbon source, then yes, then we need to maximize the yield. So then we have to use the CO2 that's produced in ethanol fermentation to maximize the carbon yields. But in my world, it's quite boring. It's cost-driven, and today it's not making sense without subsidies.
Thank you very much. And then I have the honor to present our second speaker, which is Johanna Lund, who's a senior project manager at RISE, the Research Institute of Sweden, at Agri-Food and Bioscience. And she's been working then with the crops part of this presentation, so crops producing plastic, amongst other, with colleagues from Lund University. So welcome, Johanna.
Hi everyone, thank you for inviting me to this exciting event. I'm going to start to talk about the demand and the resources when it comes to residues from agriculture. As you heard earlier, there is an estimated increase for bio-based plastics and it is with around 2 million tons per year in the coming 5 years, according to European Bioplastics. And by converting from fossil-based to renewable materials, the net carbon dioxide emissions can be reduced sharply. Maybe you don't want to reduce, you can use it. So I'm going to talk about mainly about the agricultural residues, but what is used today is actually the main crop. What is used at the renewable materials, and it is mainly maize and sugarcane, and today it is around 0.02% of the arable land on a global scale that is used to produce bioplastics. And when we talk about using crops for bioplastics, we talk about the first generation of bioplastics. And when we talk about using agricultural residues and forestry residues, we talk about the second generation bioplastics. And actually the bioplastic industry, they have a commitment to use more renewable resources, but they also have a commitment to use non-food crops. And that is why it's important to change to use the residues. But actually today, it is mainly, it's a marginal use of the residues. It is mainly in a research state. So if we look at the residues from agriculture, we have 2 types of residues. So we have field residues, and this is the material that is left in the field after the crop has been harvested. So it is, for an example, cereal straw and beet leaves, for an example. And then it is also processed residues from the agro-industry. So it is materials left after the crop is processed into a more usable resource. So it can be husks, seeds, beet fiber, and molasses. And I think it's important here to state that we should actually focus to use the non-eatable residues, because what is, for an example today, the field residues, they are mainly left in the field today. But the process residues from the agro-industry, they are used for feed, for an example. So there's already use today. So we should focus on the non-edible residues. It is also very important to look on the sustainable potential. We need to balance the needs for land for food production with the need for bio-based raw materials of various kinds. It is important that the sustainable removal of residues, that we should have the sustainable removal without jeopardizing the production capacity of the farmland. If we take straw as an example, the straw, we cannot remove all the straw from the field, because the straw is also needed to build up the soil organic carbon content in the soil. So for an example, we should maybe leave the straw every 3rd year. It is different recommendations, but we should be aware of that. And then it's also important to remember that we have climate change, and it will affect the productivity on the farmland. So for an example, if we look into 2050, we also have to look at the sustainable potential that year, and it will change. There is, for an example, predictions for here in Skåne, we will have a decrease in the productivity in the farmland. And that is something that we have to keep in mind. So the potential will change, and it has to be sustainable. So here's just some examples of bioplastics or biopolymers that can be produced from agricultural residues. We have PLA, which it is produced from lactic acid, and it's a biodegradable polymer. We have also PHA, which is a polymer and a polyester, and it can actually be biodegraded in nature, in soil and water. We have PBS, which is produced from succinic acid, and It's also biodegradable. And then we have PE, which is a non-biodegradable polymer, and it can go into existing recycling system. And that is also a debate that is going on regarding biodegradable and non-biodegradable, and the connection to the recycling systems. And that is something maybe we'll go into in the debate afterwards. So what are really the benefits of using residues from agriculture to make plastics? Well, we have the depletion of the oil resources. And if we move from using the importing fossil oil to be able to utilize the renewable resources that are produced in a local or regional level, then we will have less import dependence. And then it's also possibilities to support the rural economy in Europe. I mean, if we can valorize the residues, then it will also strengthen the farmers' economy. And that is something that I, as an agronomist, think is very important. And also, of course, we have the climate change. So what are the challenges? Of course, there is a lot of challenges. We have the cost factor for making the materials. This is materials that can be quite difficult. I mean, it is materials with lignocellulose, we have the hemicellulose, we have many different, we don't have pure glucose. We have material that needs pre-treatment, for example, maybe a steam explosion, and then we need a lot of high temperature and a lot of pressure, and that it's also very costful. We also have a high raw material and supply cost. The yield for the residues is quite low per hectare, and it is spread over a large area. So the logistical problem, or to collect the material, can be quite complicated and quite expensive. There is also, of course, less knowledge of the properties if you compare to the fossil raw material. And then there is needs for investments, and then also there is a large quality variations of the raw material also. So there is challenges. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Johanna. I would just, because it was mentioned here, both the bioplastic and biodegradable plastic, and maybe it's important for the debate later on to just clarify the difference. Would you like to do that? Or do you want me to do it? Oh yeah, you can maybe. Do that.
Well, I think I should stand up. The majority of the plastics is non-biodegradable. I don't know, is it 25% that is biodegradable? Yeah, there is at least less share of material. And it is also important that it is not biodegradable in nature. It is biodegradable in an industrial composting facility. And with certain temperature and a certain time. So yeah, it's important not to throw away the biodegradable plastic in nature, to be aware of that. Yeah.
Yes.
You can, if there's
no, yeah, but just like for bio-based plastic is then that the carbon in the plastic is derived from some biogenic source, so not fossil plants. But then biodegradable plastic is not so much an issue of where the carbon comes from, it's rather a property of the material. So it's two very different things, and it's important to keep them separate in this debate. It is normally argued. We will see. And then I would like to present our third speaker, which is Tobias Dan-Nielsen, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Department for Political Science here at Lund University. And he works in a big plastic project called STEPS, Sustainable Plastic Transition Pathways, with governance questions regarding plastics. So, very welcome.
Thank you, Ellen. Yes, so today I'll talk to you about Bioplastics governance, or at least I'll touch upon it, because it's very broad. So governance here means something broader than just simply sort of state legislation. I'll talk about that as well, but sort of what's steering bioplastics from a political perspective. And I will also talk about some of the barriers. So I heard some of the barriers already to why we don't have more bioplastics today than we have. I'll talk about another one big one, called the fossil industry. So here we have a picture of Lego and sort of one of the bright futures of bioplastics. So they announced that they will be switching to bioplastics in the future. A lot of other companies have done something similar. But before we get that far, let's look at some of the barriers and some of the problems of that. So this next slide shows that this is sort of the global production of bioplastics. And as you can see, it's looking good. It's sort of a slightly upward trend. So we're expecting, or the industry itself is expecting slightly more global production of bioplastics. The green one being the bio-based, the ones that are sort of sourced from non-fossil feedstocks. And the orange ones, yeah, the ones that are biodegradable. So they're sort of lumped together. But here we can see sort of promising. So 2 million tons of bioplastics is being produced, with slightly more to be produced in the future. But if we zoom out and look at the whole plastic sector as such, we can see that that's very little of the total market. So that's about 1% or less than 1% of the 335 million tons of plastic that's being produced every year. And we can see there was a slightly upward trend. More investments are going into bioplastics, but that's up against a huge investment into fossil fuels and sort of the petrochemical industry. So here we just have a site, this is an example from North America, where we have 164 billion that has been sort of spent or invested into the petrochemical sector, and very much bent on keeping plastics fossil-based. And this has sort of been very much promoted by the shale boom, the shale gas boom in the US. So that's a sort of a cheap and very effective feedstock for the whole plastic industry at the moment. So this is sort of, you need to keep that in mind. So this is sort of the pressure, or sort of the lock-in, the economic lock-in, if you want, of fossil plastics. If you look at some of the actors that are sort of the biggest actors that are involved in bioplastics, we see that they are also sort of either owned or partially owned by traditional fossil petrochemical companies. So you see, so that's sort of, and that's not necessarily only a bad thing, but that's just to keep in mind that there's a very strong lock-in. So there's a strong economic lock-in, but also a lot of the players that are sort of big in producing bioplastics are also sort of locked into the sort of fossil fuel, if you want. Another barrier is that plastics is not just plastics. We heard about bioplastics, biodegradable plastics. There's also a whole range of other types of plastics, and turning these conventional plastics into bioplastics require or have different challenges and different opportunities. So what works for one of these boxes won't work necessarily for some of the other boxes. We heard about the food and feed debate. That's also, at least from a political side, something that's very one of the big barriers for sort of policymakers at the moment to sort of put too much emphasis on bioplastics. Here we have the European bioplastics, sort of their take on it, saying that it's a very small part of the whole combined agriculture area which we need for bioplastics. Other figures will say other things, and also if we think about if we would scale it up to sort of 100%, or given the current production methods, we would require a lot more, of course, agricultural land. Okay, so what are sort of the legislative trends? What's happening on bioplastics when we look at some of the more policy side? So we have the EU plastic strategy, which was launched just last year, yeah. And that sort of sets out this is not sort of a directive as such, but it sets out the direction that the EU is looking at. What are they thinking at as sort of the key challenges and the key opportunities or the key strategies for making plastics a more sustainable sector. So they're focused very much on recycling, on reducing the unnecessary use, so in particular single-use plastics, and also on marine litter. And one thing that's missing here is bioplastics. So if you look at a previous, draft of the strategy, bioplastic figured much more prominently, but it was sort of downplayed, you could say, in the final version, partly because of some of the reasons I talked about before. If we zoom in a bit on the national policies, we can see the Danish action plan for plastics, also sort of very much in line with the EU, focusing much more on recycling, bioplastic not so much mentioned. The same sort of with the public inquiry on plastics, the Swedish one, which also sort of, again, focuses much more on recycling on plastics. It does allow a bit more for bioplastics, so there is some support for standardization, labeling schemes, and also the possibility of sort of a climate compensation fee on plastics. If we look at sort of non-governmental actors, so we have Coca-Cola and the whole soda bottle industry sort of being very much under fire, under pressure at the moment. So Coca-Cola launched this plant bottle, which is their way of sort of saying that we want a more sustainable plastic bottles in the future. So the plant bottle is part of that is a bio-based PET, so bio-based plastics. We also have sort of an alliance between big consumer groups, so Lego, Procter & Gamble's, and others, sort of trying to sort of find common solutions for how we can sort of promote more bioplastics in their products. But also sort of other companies that are sort of that don't want to go into bioplastics. So I mentioned one selling, so that's sort of the ICA of Denmark, sort of saying we don't think bioplastics is the option right now to go. We were much more focused on recycled plastics. And also you don't see bioplastics being sort of the great banner for a lot of the NGOs that are advocating on plastics. Another sort of thing that is sort of coming in influencing the whole debate is the EU bioeconomy strategy. And there we see sort of what they're sort of promoting with bioeconomy is much what we just heard the previous presenter talk about, sort of that it would save a lot of potential emissions. It would create new markets, new jobs, especially in rural areas. It will create a much more or a less dependent EU, or EU less dependent on fossil feedstocks, and also promote a lot of innovation in the forest and agriculture sectors. So these are some of the things that are also politically being promoted, and also sort of, I guess, one of the drivers for potentially for bioplastics. Conclusions. So there's a strong lock-in that needs to be kept in mind. So the economic, political, and technology lock-in into sort of keeping plastics fossil-based that needs to be overcome. At the moment, there's a lower political emphasis on bioplastics and on the whole sort of emissions agenda, and then recycling and pollution. If you look forward, I think it's important to focus not just on the mitigation potential for bioplastics, but also a lot of the potential innovations, the new types of plastic we can come, but also a lot of the jobs or the industries that could be created by promoting bioplastics. Right now, it's very much a packaging-driven market, so it's the soda companies that are responding to this, and I think there's also a great potential to look into other sectors, of building, automobile, electronics, and so forth. And also, last but not least, more awareness, so sort of trying to overcome some of the misunderstandings, or also what opportunities, what are the limitations of bioplastics. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, all of you. I can then invite the three of you up on stage. Thank you very much for your presentations. I learned a lot of new things, and I think we all did. Before I start with my other questions, I would like to know what you think of the topic of the seminar. So is the feedstock issue of plastic really that important when it comes to plastic and sustainability? In the beginning, I mentioned other sustainability aspects: overconsumption, recycling, microplastics in the ocean, in the water, etc., hazardous chemicals. There are several sort of hot topics when it comes to plastic. So what is your take on that? Maybe you can start, Tobias, who didn't get a question after your presentation.
Yeah, I think politically it's one of the big ones to overcome. So whether it's a problem or not, I think we can discuss that. But I think politically that's one of the great barriers. So when you talk to policymakers or others, why bioplastic wasn't that emphasized in, for example, the EU plastic strategy, it was a lot on the food and feed debate. So that there were large concerns. So I think the bioplastic sector as such has to overcome this sort of resistance or this perception that it will lead to competition with food and feed. So politically, yes.
From the feedstock perspective, do you think that it's an important issue with feedstock for plastics? Or how would you sort of arrange them in order, or is this seminar meaningful? Is it meaningful to go into the other discussions? I mean, you often, I guess, meet the other aspects of plastics, or? No?
No, I mean,
Well, I think we need all the renewable resources that we have to be able to replace the fossil feedstocks. I think that it will be necessary.
Okay.
And maybe like we can use if you talk about carbon dioxide, maybe that's like the third or fourth generation bioplastic. So maybe we can use the crops now, and then we can use the agriculture residues, and then carbon dioxide. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. I think we also need to take one step back and also consider the vast amount of carbon that's should already be circulating in the system, which is not. I mean, if we look at the renewables, it today can only fulfill a very small part of the total demand. But if we move from 5-10% recycling rate to 50%, we cut down consumption so much more than what we can do in the short term with renewables. So looking at more recycling, better recycling, other types of recyclings would be very high up on my list to do as well.
So you're starting to describe sort of what the direction should be of the plastic, and so what is the direction then of this transformation of the plastic system? Is there a clear vision? And with other environmental issues like climate change, we have these targets that sort of we all work towards, or the global sustainable goals sitting there in the corner. Is there any similar visions or targets regarding the plastic system?
Anyone in governance?
Yeah.
Or in your specific research projects or field?
Obviously, I think the direction, which, I mean, depends where you look, but at the EU, sort of the direction is circular economy to a large extent, which is sort of setting the agenda. So the idea that we need to recycle plastic. So if you compare it to metal or glass, plastic has been reused a lot less. So this is sort of an obvious challenge to try to tackle and try to improve the recyclability of plastic. But of course, as we also discussed, there's not necessarily unanimity into how do we get there. So there's a lot of different actors that might want to get there in different ways. But I would say at the moment within the EU, circular economy is sort of this shaping the agenda on plastics.
And taking one step, or looking more on technical aspects, there are new ways of thermal recycling that we haven't seen before that is now coming online in pilot and full scale, moving from plastics to liquid hydrocarbons that could either substitute diesel gasoline or be used for producing the feedstocks that one makes the plastic out of. So there are new approaches to thermal recycling that are quite interesting.
Yeah, and I also think that it's important when you utilize, for example, in the circular bioeconomy, then it's important to valorize the the biomass, for an example, from agriculture and from the forest, I think also on the residues. And I think it's important now when we talk about, for example, biorefineries, then it's important to utilize the whole crop. For an example, if we look on the beet leaf, then we can extract the proteins and it can be utilized for feed or for food. And then the other part, the fibers can be used for bioplastics, for example. So it's important to have this thinking from the beginning, this circular thinking.
And then when discussing bioplastic, this second generation topic always comes up, right? So why is that so important that we use second generation biomass?
Yeah, I think it's important because to avoid this risk with the conflict with the food production. I think maybe it will be more and more important in the future. I mean, now maybe we could use the crops. There are some life cycle analysis that shows that we could use, even though if you think about if you harvest the rainforest in Brazil and import feed to Sweden, for an example, but it's also something that I lost my sorry.
But I agree, and I also think that's what makes bioplastic also very interesting. Not just that if we switch all conventional plastics to bioplastics made from sugarcane in Brazil, we're not maybe really overcoming some of the sustainability issues around plastics. But if we start to using agricultural waste or other kinds of feedstocks, this is sort of becomes very interesting and a lot more. So what is one company's waste might be somebody else's fuel, and that's when I think when things start to be really interesting, and we can see sort of this circularity or this sort of new innovations coming up.
Yep. We see a lot of new value chains being created. If we do the analog with the biofuel business, forestry companies working with paper and pulp companies, as well as refineries, which has never happened before. We're going to see the same type of strategic collaborations between maybe sugar companies and companies that produce plastics that you don't see historically. So it's interesting and exciting times, I think.
But do you see this direction within the carbon dioxide utilization as well? Because you mentioned it's more sort of a research topic currently, but
to me it's more of a research area at the moment. I don't think that there will be any plastic capacity based on CO2 in the short term.
But is there that, because this title sort of imposes that there's a conflict between carbon dioxide and crops? Would you agree on that, or what's your take on that?
No, I don't think so. Actually, I think they are both needed, but it's in different part of the future.
And you mentioned, Tobias, on the plastic strategies within the EU and in Sweden, pointing towards direction once again, that it's very much focused on recycling, and you all come into the topic of recycling here. Would you say it's a weak point, or would you criticize it for not focusing on like the non-fossil feedstock, or is that?
Yeah, I think we have to sort of tackle if we want to decarbonize or venture into a low carbon economy, then I think switching to non-fossil feedstocks is an absolute necessity. So we have to tackle that at some point. We have to get into there somewhere. Of course, when it comes to plastic, then probably recycling and pollution is something that really can be used to galvanize people's attention and sort of make governments change their policies. So that's sort of the first couple of steps. But I think definitely long term, the whole fossil feedstocks, that agenda needs to be tackled, and that's unfortunately not really, governments are not to the same extent focusing on that as they are in other sectors where they're talking about decarbonization.
We also have to keep in mind that the residues from agriculture, there will also be a need to use for other purposes. So that's also something that, now it's not utilized, but it will be a conflict also in the future. And what should it be used for? So that's something that's another, but it's also important to keep in mind here, I think.
So there's both a lack of biomass resources and sort of an abundance, but
Yeah, but I mean, we do potential studies all the time. Like it can be utilized for this purpose and this and this and this, and like what should it really be utilized for in the future? So, but then in that way, I think maybe plastic is the good way because it it can be bind in this product for a while, except for being combusted, for an example.
And then it's also where you draw the boundary of plastic. Plastic is so much more than just the carbon atoms that makes the polymers. You have fillers and you have other materials, like in all the black cables, the plastic contains a lot of carbon black. Are we also trying to decarbonize the carbon black production? Where do we draw the sort of the boundaries and how much can be recycled of that?
But what will be then your visionary take on that?
Mean question. We started working with renewable carbon black production in 2009. It didn't work out very well, but maybe we did it wrong. But I think this is a topic that we need to revisit. I mean, especially with these thermal recycle type plants, there are streams coming out of those that are really interesting as a feedstock to these chemical unit operations. So I think we'll probably manage to work around that as well.
I can maybe open up for some questions from the floor if you have any already. I think there's a microphone coming up. Yes?
Thank you. So I have a question. I think it's best suited for Tobias. I was wondering if the companies that are making the bioplastics or doing the most research about it are all owned by fossil fuel companies, how can we actually trust that the future of bioplastics exists? It seems like there's mixed incentives.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think so I don't think these are all necessarily bad guys that don't want to promote this. If there's a market for it, if there's a will or is demand for it, then I think they will push more for bioplastics. And you can say one of the advantages of having these big conglomerates in charge of this transition is that they know that sort of the logistical challenges. They have the funds to sort of promote the R&D that is needed much more so than some of the niche companies might have. So that, on a positive spin, they might be able to facilitate the transition quick if there's money in it. But I think it would be naive to think that they would just do it sort of out of their goodwill, so they would probably try to slow this or be in control of the transition. And I think that's something that needs to be taken into consideration, at least for the politicians, so that it won't happen by itself.
There's this misconception that change in the chemical and petrochemical industry is really slow. It's actually not if the conditions are right. So if you look at the British chemical industry, it transformed in less than 10 years from coal to petroleum in the 40s. I mean, it's not what we want to see today, but it shows that the industry is really good at adapting if the conditions are right. So what we need to do is make sure that the conditions are right so that we force them to change rather than sit around and wait for them to do something that is less economic than it is their current operation.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, you could also say that, I mean, if you look at sort of the projections from the petrochemical side, even sort of with the ban on single-use plastics that we have now within the EU, they're not really projecting a huge change, and that's maybe because they can operate fast, they can change fast, but they're also very much a conservative industry that likes maybe not to take too many new risks. So sort of when you look at their projections, they're not really seeing a huge dent in their sort of in the demand for fossil fuels in the future coming from plastics. Maybe like a small dent, and that's about it, but not sort of not even a reduced growth, but not sort of a lower demand for this. So yeah, like I said, it won't come by itself, and at the moment, sort of they're sitting they're very much in control of what's happening, and they're not really seeing that things will change that fast at the moment.
Okay, yeah, we have a second question.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask the problematics of biodegradable plastics and bio-based plastics. So when the mix is happening, and what is the problematic if, for example, in recycling or something, machines and stuff?
So to me, both types of plastics are really important. I mean, there are applications where biodegradability is not desirable. So if you're putting a cable from one side of the Atlantic to the other one, you don't want it to break down in 2 days, 30 days, whatever. So there's really a space for both of them. I don't know. I lost my thread. Sorry.
No, but I
Help
just
me.
think, yeah.
Do you want to?
No, I mean, you have to keep in mind that it's affecting the recycling system in that way that it's different types of plastics. I mean, it's also the same today. That's why also it's only a small share of the fossil plastic today in Sweden that is recycled. It is, I think, the official number is 7, but I think it's actually 3% of the plastic. The other part is combusted. I mean, the reason is because it's different type of plastics and it's difficult to recycle it. I mean, we don't have that. They're building a new plant now for recycling of fossil-based plow, and they're trying to also talk to the producers of the bioplastics, and so there is a discussion going on, but it's really complicated. And I know there is some university campuses and also some hospitals. They have like a separate recycling system for the bio-based plastics, and maybe that's a solution. But yeah, it's also very costful, so I don't know.
So that's one of the problems when you do separation of the different qualities of plastic. You normally just do it on density, and some of these new plastics that we're introducing, which are renewable, they have the same density, so they end up in the same place, but it's mixed plastic. So it's, from a technical perspective, a challenge with these renewable materials.
So the government set rules on what kind of plastics there should be, and I think there's like just from normal fossil-based plastics, there are heaps of different plastic types, right? So that makes it also difficult to recycle them and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting how the plastic debate sort of always sneaks its way into recycling. But if I connect back to your question on policies or how you said something that the fossil industry, or maybe you want to answer that. I don't know what was it.
No, that's
no. I understood it as a sort of end comment on it. How should then this change take place for the fossil industry to? What is needed for this change to happen, that the fossil feedstock will be replaced towards more bio-based or perhaps in a long-term carbon dioxide? What is your take on sort of what is needed from, I don't know, you said funding, you mentioned various challenges, all of you, for this transformation to take place?
To me, a big driver for transforming the chemical industry at large is the reduced use of transportational fuels. So the less liquid fuels, less hydrocarbons we use, or fossil hydrocarbons we use in transportation, the more or less attractive the residual petroleum will be as a chemical feedstock. Initially, it will be lowering cost, but then prospect and all that will be driving the cost upwards for fossil feedstock. So electrification is a big driver in my book.
Yeah, but I guess given that electric cars still haven't really sort of thrown out conventional cars from the market, this transition might take a while. So I think we need something more than just sort of waiting for electric cars to sort of, electric airplanes to sort of reduce overall demand for oil and gas. So I mean, we could look at oil and gas are taxed heavily when it comes to transport. You could maybe think of similar schemes for taxing carbon when it's used for materials, when it's used for plastics. So carbon tax on plastics, for example, could be something. Of course, it could be controversial, but that could be one mechanism you could think about where so they would even out the market a bit more, so they would sort of make the bio-based plastics more favorable
than they are today. And then I also think, I mean, this is also something that's been pushed, so we can say, I mean, regulation, governments need to come in to standardize what is meant by bioplastics, biodegradable plastics, creating more favorable, markets for bioplastics. But I think also sort of this push that we see from consumers. So I mentioned the Coca-Cola and these companies, so they're already feeling sort of the pressure right now to sort of change. So I think that's also something that's sort of galvanizing this momentum for sort of the need for change, and sort of put more pressure on companies to find new solutions to sort of change their markets. I don't think plant bottle necessarily is sort of the best idea, but it's maybe one step towards or signal that these big companies are thinking about different alternatives to what they're producing at the moment. So I think public pressure, you shouldn't underestimate that as well.
But do you think that the governmental pressure within sort of the Swedish governmental inquiry or the Danish one that you mentioned or the EU strategy, are they aiming towards this direction?
No, I don't think they're aiming necessarily at the moment towards this suggestion. I think with the EU, so it's interesting now that the Commission launches sort of a report on what's needed for research and development, and there they flagged bio-based plastics much more than they did in their strategy, and it might also come more in with the sort of the bioeconomy strategy than it is currently sort of emphasized in the plastic strategy. Now I lost my thread. So yeah, it's not at the moment. It's not coming by itself. That's for sure. Now I lost my thread as well.
I'll change person then.
Yeah, but it's also like you get stuck in this debate biodegradable versus non-biodegradable bioplastic. I think we should focus on the fossil versus non-fossil. I mean, when we get, for an example, the report from Naturvårdsverket, it's a lot about criticizing the biodegradable bioplastics. I think we should focus more about how to replace the fossil-based plastics.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you think then is needed to enhance the focus on bio-based plastics rather than criticizing certain aspects of the system?
Good question.
Or do you think that there's something missing regarding how bio-based is presented or debated?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of information lacking. For an example, I think a lot of people, they think that this, now I go into this debate myself, biodegradable versus non-biodegradable, but I think that the plastics bag, for an example, that is not biodegradable, then there's information about that people, they buy this bag and they think that it's biodegradable, and I think there's a lot of, we should have the right information, what is what and what can be utilized for.
And where do you think then, because there is also some topics on that plastics shouldn't maybe be used everywhere or more, but where should we use bioplastics?
I think it, for an example, also, maybe we should not discuss composite, but that's also a way that when you mix fibers from agriculture, for an example, with plastics, then it can also be utilized in cars, for an example. So in a more, when you can utilize a large amount. And I think also in the engångsbestick, single-use plastics. Yeah, I think that's where we can start at least.
I'm not so sure about single-use plastics, though. No. I mean, because the single-use plastics, so that's been banned because a lot of single-use plastics end up in nature, and if they're made by bioplastics or even biodegradable plastic, that won't really solve the issue of plastic pollution, since they won't biodegrade by themselves in nature. So I think the bioplastics and biodegradable plastics shouldn't be seen as sort of a thing that we can use for single-use plastics, for example, to make it more sustainable. I think we should considering not maybe using so much single-use plastics and maybe using or changing to other materials altogether, but maybe using less straws, for example, could be one start. But so I think bioplastics, coming back to your question, I think it could be used, maybe not so much in single-use plastics, but in a lot of the other, ideally in a lot of the other applications we could use. I mean, if we have sort of a very similar or identical product to what's on the market now, but just also bear in mind that if pollution is what's setting the political agenda, then biodegradable and bioplastics is not really solving that sort of problematic at the moment, at least.
But there is also bioplastics that it can be biodegraded. For an example, the starch plastic and the PHA, it can also be degraded in nature. So those plastic maybe for single-use.
But
items.
should we, isn't that saying that we should put single-use products in nature?
Yeah, no, that's a bad way, yeah. No, I haven't, yeah.
What were you going to say, Christian?
Exactly the same thing.
Yeah, okay.
We continue to encourage a bad behavior, which is probably not what we want to do.
Sorry, you have a question? Well, actually two. Christian, the first one is, in academia or research, what have you found as efforts to capture the carbon dioxide and turn it into some sort of usable thing? And the second one is for Johanna. What are the properties of the plastics that are elaborated from the waste of the agriculture in terms of how they it gets back to nature somehow? Because you mentioned that nowadays biodegradables plastics need to be in some sort of facilities to be biodegradable somehow.
You go first. No, just I remember mine. Short.
Well, I mean the plastics that is produced, or the bioplastics or biomaterials that is produced from agricultural residues, it's exactly the same as the fossil plastics. So it's not another type of plastics. It's the same type of plastics. So, but I mean, if it is biodegradable plastics, then it can maybe go into biogas production, or it could go into a compostable or industrial composting facility. Was that the answer?
The properties of the future plastics, so to say, the ones made out of the waste of the
from agriculture.
You mentioned before that those made out of the residues of.
Yes. But they are produced from fossil resources today. Yeah. Or not the PHA, but yes. PLA, PBS, and PE are produced from fossil resources today. No, sorry. Yes, yes. But PBS and PE. Sorry, yeah.
And to answer my question, the streams that we normally focus on are concentrated CO2 streams. So we work quite a lot with upgrading of biomethane, so removing CO2 from biomethane or biogas. That stream is something that we've looked quite intensely at. The CO2 from ethanol, but also from various points in the chemical and petrochemical industry. We work mainly with concentrated CO2. We don't think there's a point in starting to work with harvesting CO2 from air until you have exhausted all the point sources where it's concentrated.
You had a question I saw also, you got.
One of you, I can't remember which one it was, showed an alarming slide about the ramping up of the US fossil-based plastics industry. It seems to run counter to EU policy and the direction that you're all talking about today. Do you have any comments about that? It seems a bit worrying.
It's driven by costs. It's the boring one again. So we have a new, or rather new feedstock in the petrochemical industry, which is shale gas, low cost feedstock. We now see production costs for plastics and polymers and other things in the US as low as from the of Saudi Arabia, Middle East areas. So it's basically that there has been a new feedstock that has been coming along, which is chemically similar to the previous one, natural gas, but it's now making more, making production at low cost available in new regions. And that's what's driving the force, the build out. And then it's also connected to local legislation. The US has a ban on exporting crude products. So you have to refine it in the US to be able to export it, which means that it's sort of artificially low pricing because there's an overproduction compared to current consumption, which depreciates the prices.
Yeah, so I think it's anything but boring.
Yeah, okay.
Because I see a lot of political politics involved, obviously. Yeah. So when we're talking about single-use plastic ban, or that we're trying to turn the tide on plastic pollution, something that's missing from this equation is often the huge amount of investments that are happening, that are going into sort of continuing business as usual on plastics and the whole petrochemical industry. And these are not small figures, these are just one, and that's just North America. If you look at it globally, there's even more. Middle East and South Asia are even expanding even more. So that's just to show that what we're up against as well. So there's a huge political, economical, technical lock-in here. And I say political because a lot of these companies are also state-owned or very key industries within a country. So there's been a huge historical political lock-in between these companies. So these are sort of massive interests, massive conglomerates that are sort of shaping the agenda as well. And that needs to be considered. And I think that's often missing. So when we're discussing bioplastics and what we need to do, what we need to overcome, I think one of the things that we're missing from this discussion is the whole fossil fuel lock-in. And that's what I was trying to point out today. And even when we talk about in the sort of EU discussions and so on, that's not really been addressed. It's further down the pipeline that we're sort of tackling this issue, predominantly at the end of the pipeline. But we need to look at sort of the very start as well. And I think that's missing at the moment.
And we always talk about subsidies with respect to renewables, but there's also quite a lot of subsidies going into the fossil production. It's a strategic reserve, strategic product. So we, as government, spend quite a lot of money, tax money, on defending the reserves and basically subsidizing production of the fossil stuff. So.
We could all sit back and accept that, and they'll come around eventually and they'll understand that this needs to be done. This is extremely urgent. I mean, this is a global problem and it's extremely urgent. So I'm kind of looking for, is there any pressure from the EU on the US or on the Asian markets, or is anything happening on that front? It's a political question, obviously.
With the current regime in the US.
Exactly. Yeah. I think this is, and I guess, the EU can do little. The EU is a small player or a smaller player in the whole petrochemical industry. So sort of the power they have to put pressure, they could maybe, again, put a price on carbon in plastics that could maybe send a signal, given that they're buying a lot of plastic and a lot of plastic products. That could maybe, exert some kind of influence on the market. But at the moment, the big markets are sort of pushing forward with conventional plastics. One of the biggest company in the world at the moment, well, at least if you look at the net profits, is a Saudi Arabian oil company. Just bought sort of a huge petrochemical company. So you can just see that these things are not. This link is tightening, and sort of this direction, if you will, is sort of is being emphasized more and more, and that needs to be. Yeah, I think there will probably be a political will, but at the moment, the focus is elsewhere.
But I mean, on the issue of investment that you're speaking of, we have seen a recent interest from investors also to avoid sort of, I guess, inspired by this divestment movement. So they're avoiding to end up in bad investments within plastics industries. I know that you've been working on that as
So
well.
yeah, definitely. I mean, the whole divestment movement and a lot of sort of the current EU task force on sustainable investments are sort of changing this. So a lot of the companies investing in the fossil industry is probably sort of thinking twice, or at least assessing the risks on a longer term. And I think, again, moving down, probably this is one of the places that could potentially change the game a bit if investors sort of hold back a bit. But there's a lot of money still within those sectors. So,
but another problem, or what you want to call it, is also how complex this business is. I mean, these are perfectly substitutable products. It's a global market. If we in Sweden put a ban on, or a tax on, our production in Stenungsund, we would probably just shut down that plant as a large chemical player, and we would move that production somewhere else. And then we have to balance these job versus productivity versus sustainability. So yeah, it's one of those, we all need to be in agreement all over the world at once, things which rarely or ever happen, unfortunately.
But you mentioned Stenungsund now. I know you've been working with the companies there. It's a big chemical cluster. And as we've sort of heard here, the industry has a lot of power within this topic. It's not so much about policy or policy actions, because they are sort of in the knee of the power of the industry. So you that have some industry insights. What would you? You say that if we switch feedstock in Stenungsund, they will just shut down. Is there no other possibility? They have this collaboration called Sustainable Chemistry, where they have an aim and ambition to become fossil-free, as I understand it.
Yeah, pass. I mean, the initiatives are nice, but to my humble understanding, they're rarely anchored on a global level. I mean, the Swedish branches of these companies oftentimes want much, much more than what they're actually wanting or willing to actually do globally or centrally. So, but yeah,
So you don't think they can achieve it, or who needs to act for it to happen?
I don't know that. I'm just a simple technology guy.
yeah, I think government, but also, like I said, pressure, bottom-up pressure. I mean, I think the discussion that they will simply move or we'll lose jobs is something that we often hear, and it's partially true, obviously, but it's also, I think there needs to be some kind of pressure and some kind of signal, some kind of will. So maybe the tax will be on the products we buy, maybe rather than the production. I think there is ways around it. We've done it with other sectors where we sort of lowered the CO2 emissions from these sectors. So I think it can be done on plastics, but you're right, plastics is complicated. It is a complex sector. The whole petrochemical, as you showed on your slide, is a very complex sector. But I don't think it's just because we haven't managed to really regulate that industry. That tough doesn't mean that it cannot be done. And I think that now sort of the tides are turning a bit. Investors are changing their mood, maybe. Sort of the awareness of this huge login is sort of become maybe more aware. So there are some signs that things can be changed, but we need to, and I think that, again, coming back to what I was saying, sort of the focus needs to be on this as well, and we need to think of how we can sort of break this lock-in, and that won't be any easy task for sure. But if we don't try, then we won't succeed.
But Johanna, you have some insights in the Swedish development of bioplastics, of resources, right? The crops that you've been working are Swedish, yeah. So and you also mentioned financing as a challenge to develop this area. And where would you say that if you had like $10 million or euros, where would you invest it within the Swedish, for Sweden to be a leader then, I guess, in developing bioplastics?
Yeah, for an example, I think that there needs to be some kind of a demo facility where you can try to have a trial and error and try to find out more about how the materials work and the different properties, and there needs to be that type of facility, I think. Maybe on the same site as fossil production, maybe, or to try to produce these green bioplastics. for an example, or the polymers.
Okay, so maybe I should let someone else ask questions again. Yeah?
Yeah, you mentioned that the bioplastics need large industrial facilities to treat it. My question is, how much capacity is being planned or already being built for the treatment of the bioplastics?
In Sweden, you mean, or? There is actually not that much produced today, so in the future. There is some small production of PBS in France, I think, and then there is in Thailand, yeah, but that's from crop. Corbion has production from sugarcane. The treatment, for the pre-treatment, you mean, or
Recycling.
Waste management, or?
The waste management part, like when the bioplastic is.
I think you mean biodegradable. That's what you.
a bit.
Both, like for bio-based and for biodegradable, like they all need to go to some facilities.
Yeah, in Sweden we don't have any industrial compost facilities, composting facilities. There is possibilities. It's not working today, but there is possibilities in the future to use it for in the biogas process. So there is research going on.
Thanks. I saw another question coming up there. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for sharing all this information. It's very useful. Tobias, you mentioned before circular economy and how you think of integrating all of this into a circular economy, and it deals with basically circulating materials infinitely, hopefully, within a system. And my question is, how do you see bioplastics being recirculated? How harmful is, for example, the recycling processes? Do they keep the same quality of the bioplastics? Do you need to add virgin material to the recycled one? And also, what kind of chemicals does this recycling release into the atmosphere as well? Because we do need to think of a second life cycle, third life cycle when we discuss circular economy. And you offered an example of the electric cars. And of course, that's a great move forward. But if the electrical grid that powers these cars is coal-based, we're not getting anywhere really. So how do you see this within a system that's recirculating this bioplastics?
Yeah, you could say if the whole circular economy is coal, or if it's fossil fueled as it is now, then we need to change that. But I think coming back to the question on bioplastics, so my understanding, and so I'm not a technical, I'm a social scientist, but from my understanding, there's the drop-ins, the ones that are similar or identical. So the bioplastics that are more or less identical to the conventional types of plastics, they can sort of be processed. They have a lot of the same advantages, or they can be recycled in a lot of the same ways that existing plastics can be recycled, but also have all the pitfalls that you just mentioned. So plastics in general, depending on which polymer you look at, have X amount of times that they can be sort of recycled before the quality sort of suffers. So you need to put in more, you need to feed in some kind of a bit of virgin plastics every time you recycle it. There's the whole sorting problem that will be the same for bioplastics. So the different types of plastics, they need to be sorted, they need to be collected, we need to have more sort of clean streams. We need to have so the whole problem around recycling and that it will lead to lower quality, I think that's the same for conventional plastics as it is for bioplastics. And I think a lot of the existing facilities we have now, my understanding is that they can handle sort of the bioplastics that are identical to the conventional plastics. So there won't be any sort of huge challenge there. I think the challenge is biodegradable plastics. So they will need some kind of extra investments into the facilities. They'll need to have some kind of investments into industrial composting and other sort of treatment plants. But I think the bioplastics, it won't mean a whole lot. They face the same challenges that conventional plastics face right now. Good.
I see some comments here on the front, but maybe we can...
I was very...
Because all the fossil-based plastics, I think you mentioned that also, are not recycled properly. It's only a fraction of the fossil-based plastics. So there are challenges even there. And much of the problem comes in the recycling is also because of the additives that are present in that. And the polymers itself don't have good properties. So I think there has to be a revolution in the plastic design as such to make them so good that they can be recycled or they can be biodegraded efficiently. And also the amount of additives that you are adding is much less. The unnecessary additives don't need to be there. So I think whatever is needed for bioplastics is also needed for fossil.
Or the other way around, I mean, all the things we need to do now to sort of increase the recyclability of plastics, like reducing the amount of harmful additives, simplifying the complexity of the plastics, trying to have maybe more single types of plastic polymers. All these challenges will be the same for bioplastics.
Well, it's more like a comment. I think Christian spoke a lot about or hoped for more recycling, but I think people forget a lot of the basics, and the basics are the polymers for one thing, because no polymers are miscible. So you have to be sure that you sort it out properly. And then what Rajni said, we're talking about plastics. A plastic is a composite material, invariably. Always some kind of additives, and you don't know them. If you take the cassettes or whatever for TV sets, they're loaded with flame retardants. You don't want to use that again. So that is the biggest problem, to me at least, that there are no efficient sorting mechanism or processes as of yet, because it's all cost-driven. We know that. I mean, it has to be cheap. It has to be comparable to the virgin plastic. That's really the problem at the moment. So you have to think about that when you talk recycling. And that's the reason for that low rate of recycling, basically, I would think.
Thank you. I think you had a question back there as well.
So I have two questions. Firstly, are there plastics that are biodegradable in nature as well? Or
Yes.
No? There are, yes.
Like starch-based and stuff.
Okay. Are they used in a larger extent or no? Not a little bit?
No.
Okay, and then I was also wondering about the other biodegradable plastics that are biodegradable in certain environments. What are the products of that? And what can you do with when you've broken it down? Is there anything you can do with it? Because I'm thinking it also contains like some chemicals and fillers and things like that.
Excellent
or what do you do with it? Like,
no, but you have to, I mean, for an example, if bioplastic, it's different polymers in one plastic, and then there is often you have to have like a fossil. It's not 100% renewable material, so there's always you need some additives that are still fossil, and that is what you have that you have to recycle.
You mean sort of what is the end product of composting?
So for example, if you in composting you get the soil, for an example, and then if you put it into a biogas plant, then you get the biodigestate, and then you get the methane.
But it will still like contain those extras as well.
No, it will be degraded.
Additives.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, I see a question. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Maybe you can start presenting yourself as well, so we know who is sort of asking the question.
From Orkla Foods, food company using plastic packaging among other materials. A question back to the feedstock, the second generation feedstock. Has the global potential been estimated, and if so, how large is it in comparison with the total plastic production needs?
Yeah.
And secondly, is there any specific promising feedstock that is sort of cost attractive and in a larger scale that people are looking at?
I actually looked up that number because I thought maybe I would get that question. So the University of Applied Science in Hannover, they calculated that if we would change the whole plastic sector into using crops, then it's actually crops, not residues. It will be 5% of the total arable land in the world.
Okay,
so
but
that's the number I have.
But that's the first generation. Then.
Yeah, that's the first generation. So I don't have any numbers on the second generation. Okay. But maybe it will be like a combination of the two in the phase, and then it will be maybe only residues in the.
So by reducing food waste, we could produce plastics.
Yeah.
Loving the logic.
And the second question was, sorry.
There was about the second generation.
Yeah,
any
which
specific
ones?
promising feedstock?
The ones I think it's of course the ones I'm working with. No, but we're working, for an example, with lay grass, and this is something that's also interesting to get into the crop rotation in agriculture because it's good to build up the soil organic carbon content. So it's good to, and it's also, there's a lot of work going on also in Denmark with green biorefineries, and it's also coming to Sweden, where you take the one part for protein and then the other part you can use for bioplastics, for example. And then I think it's also interesting with straw, from cereals. We have, for an example, agroethanol in Norrköping. They are producing ethanol today, and today they are using cereals, but they're moving into using also straw. And that from that green ethanol, you can also produce bioplastics. And I think that's interesting. But that's on a Swedish level.
I saw a question down here, and then I think we sort of have to wrap up also. But you have one more question here.
Yeah. And this is a question, a recycling question again. If you could remake the whole recycling system, because now it's mainly packaging, but what happens to the old vacuum cleaner? I mean, if we could remake the whole system, what would it look like? What would it be banning additives or marking the plastic with what sort it is, or yeah.
I guess it's simple. The quick answer would be so both sort of more simple products that you know, simple types of plastics where you know what kind of plastics is in the machine. So less composite. Well, you can avoid composite materials, but sort of more transparency. What types of plastics? What's in the plastics? So more transparency, more higher quality plastics that can be recycled more times. And then I think just a whole, very much different type of market than we have today, which is maybe much bent on sort of using and disposing. So a whole sort of structural change in the way we sort of sell and buy products. So in addition to a lot more, very complex. So there's a lot of work into that, and I think there's also a lot of challenges into making, and I don't think necessarily a circular economy is going to solve all the problems. There's a lot of problems with the circular economy as well.
And then my sort of final question to all three of you would be the question of the seminar. So what is the future of plastic? If you would sort of draw your vision or image of a future sustainable plastic system or product, or on whatever level you're interested in this. Maybe I should have prepared you for this. But feel free to share your visions.
Okay, so I'll say something so I won't have so much time to think about it. So 44% of all plastic that has ever been produced has been produced since 2010. And we're going to continue to produce more and more plastics. So we need to recycle, but we need to really think about how how this future plastic is going to be produced. So I think this is definitely one of the solutions. We need to have much more bio-based plastics. But also it requires a lot more than that. So it requires both more bio-based, more agriculture, more CO2. It needs a whole range of different options, different solutions, because we're going to have a lot more of it. And at the moment, we're really bad at handling the plastics we have now. So if we don't sort of face up to this challenge is only going to sort of accelerate in the future.
I'll just continue there by saying that whatever he said, but also make sure that we don't get plastophobic. I mean, plastics are there for a reason. We use plastics in many different applications where they actually do a tremendously good job. So let's try to find a more sustainable way of using plastics and make sure that we use it in the right way instead of becoming scared of plastic, because that doesn't help anyone.
Good points.
Yeah, I think it's also, like I said earlier, also I think we need to use all the renewable resources that we have to be able to to change, to take away the fossil resources. I think that's something we have to, and not get stuck in the debate like biodegradable versus non-biodegradable, and have the right information to the consumers.
Exactly, and we've been very spoiled with having just one starting point. We'll have to use all the starting points we can find in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, so then this seminar wasn't so much a debate of the one or the other, but rather highlighting the need to include many different feedstock for creating a future, more sustainable plastic system. I guess we will hang around for some minutes if anyone has additional questions to ask us, but otherwise, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for presenting.